Good morning, everybody. I'd like to call this meeting of the Committee on Awards for Innovation in Higher Education to order. If we can go ahead and take care of a couple of housekeeping things, and then I can make a couple comments. Member Carroll, unfortunately, is not going to be able to make it with us today, so we've got the six of us. So staff, if you could call the roll.
Member Cohen?
Here.
Member Avalos? Member Burr?
Here.
Member Carroll? Member Faigin? Here. Member Florez? Here. Member Lozano?
Members, you received copies of the minutes for September 16th and September 29th. Are there any discussion or comments regarding those? Any desire for the public to comment on the minutes? Hearing none, a motion would be in order for approval?
We should probably move them separately, so move a motion for the September 16th, 2014
Okay.
minutes first.
So I'll take that as a motion for the September 16th minutes. Is there a second for that?
Second.
Second, please call the roll.
Member Cohen?
Aye.
Member Avalos?
Aye.
Member Burr? Member Carroll? Member Faigin?
Yes.
Member Florez? And Member Lozano?
Member Lozano, can I take your previous motion as another motion for the
I'll move the September
29th? Is there a second?
Second.
Second. Go ahead and call the roll.
Cohen?
Aye.
Member Avalos?
Aye.
Member Burr?
Aye.
Member Faigin?
Yes.
Member Florez? Member Lozano?
Great. So that takes care of some of the administrative stuff. We're to the chair's report. Just a couple opening comments. I think I just wanted to share that I was very impressed with the depth and diversity and collaboration reflected in the Innovation Awards. This was a competitive process, so obviously today we're going to have some people who receive awards and those who don't. We'll have the full discussion on that, but I did want to just congratulate all of the applicants for submitting the applications, and I think it's a good reminder that there are innovations and creative people working across all of higher education in California, and really the next stage of the challenge for the state is going to be to take these innovations and spread them and figure out ways that we can really bring them to other campuses, other regions, and encourage those collaborations. So just to recap the awards, if anyone is new here, these are awards for innovations completed. So it's a little unusual for government that we're not providing grants based on specific expenditures. I also wanted to let everyone know I'll ask for public comment on each item as we go before there's a formal vote taken, and then again at the end before we adjourn, if there's any remaining public comments that didn't fit into a particular agenda item, we're happy to take public comment that way as well. Depending on how long we go, we may end up taking a break, but hopefully we can kind of plow through and have a good discussion, but if a member is feeling like a break, let me know. The restrooms for both us and the audience, when you go back out, I saw they're just to the left as you leave. So with that, anyone else on the committee want to make any comments before we kind of turn to the meat of this? All right. Seeing none, let's move to agenda item A, which is, upon request, we thought people would be interested in hearing about future opportunities for additional awards contained in the governor's budget for the upcoming budget year 2015-16. So staff, if you want to provide a short presentation on the governor's budget proposal.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Christian Osmena. I'm joined by Molly Quasbarth and Camille Esch. This item, as the chair noted, is an overview of the proposal included in the 15-16 governor's budget to fund the awards for innovation in higher education. This item is presented for information only and no committee action is requested. The governor's budget includes $25 million general fund on a one-time basis for the program. Legislation accompanying the budget enumerates the program's goal of ensuring that more students graduate with bachelor's degrees within 4 years after beginning higher education. Mirroring the process established for the current year, the Director of Finance would convene the Committee on Awards for Innovation in Higher Education to make these awards. Again, the Director would serve as the committee's chair, and the committee would include a member of the State Board of Education, a member of the Board of Governors of the California Community Colleges, a trustee of the California State University, a regent of the University of California, an appointee of the Senate Committee on Rules, and an appointee of the Speaker of the Assembly. The committee would be authorized to award funds directly only to CSU campuses in the 2015-16 fiscal year. The budget focuses the program on the CSU because of the unique opportunities for improved outcomes at those campuses. However, UC campuses and community colleges could participate in efforts coordinated by CSU campuses, just as they have in the current year. With that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Anyone? Thank you, Christian. Doesn't look like we've got questions from the panel. Any public comment? Seeing none, thank you for the update. Let's go ahead and move to item B, the actual approval of awardees. Again, Christian, do you want to walk through the process that staff used to provide your recommendation and let us know what your recommendation is for us today?
Great. Thank you. This item is the selection of specific applications as awardees. Principally, the committee would be selecting those applications for which funds would be awarded in the following item on this agenda. However, as part of its action in this item, the committee may also choose to formally recognize innovation in applications that would not receive funds. I'll divide my comments into 3 parts. First, I'll provide some detail about the applications received. Second, I'll describe the process used to evaluate the applications. And third, I'll present the staff recommendation. As the committee is aware, applications were due by January 9th, 2015. The committee received 58 applications eligible for awards. I'll note a few details about the breadth of the applications received. First, the application instructions required applications to be submitted by a single coordinating institution, and campuses from each of the 3 public segments of higher education were identified as coordinating institutions in the applications that were submitted. Specifically, 8 applications were submitted by UC campuses, 21 were submitted by CSU campuses, and 29 were submitted by community colleges. However, while applications were required to identify coordinating institutions, applicants could list other institutions as participants. Therefore, the distribution of coordinating institutions is not entirely reflective of the broad participation in the efforts described in the applications. 19 applications describe changes initiated by a single campus, and 39 applications describe changes initiated by a group of institutions. In total, 16 applications identify at least one UC campus as a participant, 31 applications identify at least one CSU campus, 44 applications identify at least one community college, 3 applications identify a private institution of higher education, and 27 applications identify at least one school district or charter school. Upon receipt of the applications, staff posted them in their entirety on the program's website. In addition, applicants were asked to provide a brief abstract focusing on the changes initiated in the past year. For your reference, these abstracts are available in the meeting materials. We believe these abstracts are important narratives because they reflect the applicants' self-assessments of the most significant components of the innovations they hope are recognized through this process. I'll move now to the evaluation process. Staff had 2 primary objectives in designing this process. First, to ensure close adherence to the statutory framework and to the committee's prior direction, and second, to standardize the review to ensure fairness of the evaluation across applications. Therefore, following the committee's meetings in September, staff developed an evaluation rubric to align with the application package approved by the committee. As a reminder, the application asked institutions to describe more than just the innovations they have initiated. Applicants were asked to identify specific goals that have been established to address the particular challenges of the students being served, articulate the ways in which their innovations are linked to those goals, and provide evidence of sustained leadership and a shared vision among participants in the application. Specifically, staff incorporated the following components of the application package into the rubric. First, the committee approved weights for each of the sections of the application package as follows. For items in the context section, 10%. For items in the innovations section, 40%. For items in the sustainability section, 35%, and for items in the evaluation section, 15%. The application package includes a total of 12 individual items, each of which are grouped into one of those 4 sections. Using the weights approved by the committee for each section, staff determined weights for each of the individual items and incorporated those weights into the rubric. Second, the committee also approved statements about the quality of a strong response for each item. Staff incorporated these statements into the rubric, breaking them in part to identify particular qualities within each of them. The rubric evaluates whether a narrative response to a particular item is clearly consistent with the quality identified, partially consistent, or not consistent. The rubric allows for an application to earn a maximum score of 100 points. Each application earned a final score in the following sequence. An application was initially evaluated by 2 separate readers. Readers were assigned randomly to applications so that the same 2 readers were not necessarily assigned to the same set of applications. If the difference between the 2 initial scores was less than 10, these scores were averaged to produce a final score. If the difference between the 2 initial scores was equal to or greater than 10, the application was read by a 3rd reader. If the difference between the 2 closest scores of the 3 was less than 10, those 2 closest scores were averaged to produce a final score. And finally, if the difference between the 2 closest scores of the 3 remained equal to or greater than 10, the application was read by a 4th reader. The differences between the 2 scores at that point were all less than 10. Therefore, the 2 closest scores were averaged to produce a final score. And using these final scores, staff organized the applications into the following 5 groups. Group 1 includes applications that earned final scores between 93 and 97. Group 2 includes applications that earned final scores between 88 and 91. Group 3 includes applications that earned final scores of 83. Group 4 includes applications that earned final scores between 78 and 82. And Group 5 includes applications that earned final scores of 75 or less. I'll close by describing the staff recommendation. Staff recommends that the committee make awards to the 14 applications in Groups 1, 2, and 3. Specifically, the 5 applications in Group 1 were coordinated by CSU Monterey Bay, CSU San Bernardino, Long Beach City College, Santa Ana College, and Shasta College. The 5 applications in Group 2 were coordinated by CSU Dominguez Hills, CSU Monterey Bay, City College of San Francisco, Humboldt State University, and San Francisco State University. And the 4 applications included in Group 3 were coordinated by Butte College, CSU San Marcos, the University of California, Los Angeles, and West Hills College, Lemoore. This recommendation was made for 3 reasons. First, and primarily, these 14 applications received the highest scores in the evaluation process. Second, the recommendation would make awards to institutions located throughout the state, covering most regions. And third, the recommendation would allow the committee to make a substantial number of awards, but still provide a meaningful amount of funds in each award. In general, the applications in these groups included a range of changes to policies, practices, and systems to achieve the priorities of the program. The changes impact students entering higher education, those already enrolled in a college or university, and those transitioning across institutions. Specifically, applications described alignment of K-12 standards with the expectations of higher education, incentives for dual enrollment in high school and college courses, changes in policies and practices governing placement at the college level, stronger supports as students transition into post-secondary education, redesign of curriculum and pedagogy to improve outcomes, the use of technology to improve advising, as well as better advising and counseling, development of structures to transition students beyond undergraduate education, the implementation of technology systems to improve institutional planning and resource allocation, and the creation of formal partnerships across institutions and sectors to improve college completion. And nearly all of the applications describe several strategies. I want to emphasize that the staff recommendation does not attempt to draw a clear line between innovators and others. All of the applications received included concepts that are in many ways innovative, and if scaled and replicated, could have important impacts on higher education outcomes. Many of the applications describe similar innovations, and fundamentally that is the intent of this approach, to create an incentive for all institutions to make real progress toward achieving state priorities. The intent of the staff recommendation is different. The recommendation is the result of a systematic process aimed at identifying those applications that, to the greatest extent, address the priorities of this committee, as they were articulated in the application package. In general, those applications that earned higher scores exhibited greater levels of consistency, clarity, and coherence across all sections of the application. And finally, staff, we recognize that this is the beginning of a longer process. We intend to work with these campuses and with others to support dissemination of the innovations being implemented locally. And with that, I'll state the formal recommendation. First, the committee identifies the applications included in groups 1, 2, and 3 as specified in Appendix 3 to this item as awardees. Second, the committee recognizes the innovation of the applications included in Group 4. And third, the committee takes no further action on the applications included in Group 5. Thank you for your patience in this presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So what I'd like to do is, if there's any questions or comments about the particular procedure and scoring that the staff did, let's sort of go through that first, and then we can turn to kind of recommendation action discussion. But are there any questions for it? Go ahead.
If you don't mind.
Not at all.
I really appreciate all the hard work and the systematic approach to something that's so complicated as this. And we did have a chance to talk offline, but I wanted to ask on the record if you could answer for me the way in which the readers were trained. And that's my first question. Why don't you?
Sure, and so the readers were all employees of the Department of Finance, and so prior to reading, we provided some training on the rubric, and so walked through the rubric, walked through the particular statements and what a reader was asked to do. So a reader was asked to select one of 3 options, clearly consistent, partially consistent, not consistent for each of the items. So we had a formal training prior to the reading. After the readers had about 2 weeks to review some applications, we got back together as a group to talk in general about any questions where there might have been ambiguity and to come to some consensus around what we were looking for in particular applications. After all of the applications had been read twice, the group came together again to talk again about what they saw and where there might have been ambiguity moving forward, and to try to come to consensus again before the applications were assigned to 3rd and 4th reads. So we had several formal discussions about what staff was looking for in each of the items under the rubric.
And if you found that there was a wide disparity between how one reader ranked a particular area with another, what was the process for bringing those together?
I guess in 2 points, I think we tried to have that conversation initially so that we could have a conversation to come to consensus on an understanding of the rubric before the first set of final recommendations was done. So we tried to come to agreement as a group on that before readers were finished reading and had an opportunity to go back and look at their applications again with a sense of what the consensus was. And the second part, I think we tried to handle that in a relatively systematic way. We didn't have readers talking to each other about particular applications. And so if, as many applications did after that first round, have scores greater than 10, we simply assigned it to a 3rd reader. So we didn't, we felt like in order to maintain the systematic nature of the process, we didn't want kind of readers to be negotiating scores internally.
Go ahead, Doug.
This really isn't a question. I just wanted to thank you all for doing all this work, and how impressed I think all of us are that you could use this as a dissertation. And the one specific for me is the conversations that we had, that Molly and Christian and I had, and the requests that I had made for more information, different information regarding the results and everything were not only met, but exceeded my expectations completely. So I think it's a terrific job. Thank you very much for doing all that. It's not an easy job.
I would like to echo the same thing. I mean, I've been impressed with the process, the transparency. In every request I've made, you all have replied and given me more information to make the right decision, to really evaluate what we're doing. So, through this whole process, at the beginning I was kind of skeptical how we're going to do this, but it did come together, and it couldn't have been done without, obviously, the staff and Department of Finance making it happen for us. So I appreciate that very much.
Florez, did you have? Oh, okay. Well, why don't we turn our attention to the actual awards? And at this point, under an abundance of caution from my counsel, I've been advised that I should step out when Group 5 is being discussed based on an unrelated contract that my spouse has with one of the districts that has a college that applied. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, but my preference would be if the committee can sort of discuss Group 5, and then my counsel advised me once that's happened, I can come back in and continue the rest of the discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sue, and I will see you in a few minutes.
This is where we need the Jeopardy music playing, dun, 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 dun. So in the interest of allowing Michael to continue to participate, I'd like to make a suggestion that we start with Group 5 and consider the staff recommendation that we take no further action on the applications in Group 5, with the caveat that if there's a single application that someone might want to discuss, you could certainly do that. But if not, I would entertain a motion to adopt the staff recommendation that we take no further action on the applications in Group 5.
I'll move.
Is there a second? Before we vote, I would just like to ask, is there any public comment on that motion? If not, seeing none, I would ask the staff to call the roll.
Mr. Avalos?
A.
Ms. Burr?
Aye.
Mr. Faigin?
Yes?
Mr. Florez? And Ms. Lozano?
Thank you. Now we can go get Michael. We'll wait for just a second until Mr. Cohen returns. Member Lozano.
I know that Michael is on his way in. My comment is that there was a lot of value to putting these applications together. And while we're not taking any further action, I do hope that we can, one, thank them for the effort that went into this and feedback in any way possible our thinking about maybe what was missing in their applications, et cetera. So we just don't want to say nothing back to these.
That's a very good suggestion. Christian, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, and I think what we have indicated to applicants who have requested is that we are happy to make the item-by-item scores available to them, so that provides a bit of an opportunity to see in which sections of the application they received certain scores. So,
Senator Florez.
Thank you. As Michael's sitting, let me just kind of go a little further than Monica's comment and say what I found surprising about the process and somewhat helpful and I think very telling wasn't, I think the story behind the prize from my perspective really wasn't who won. That's in itself, I think, fantastic, and I think we'll get to those. I think it was really the amount of people that didn't apply. I mean, the folks that just kind of looked in their system and said, we're not even going to apply. And I think that, you know, even beyond Tier 5, I think the hopefully the lesson is, I think for the many community colleges, the few CSUs, and the UCs particularly, I think the issue is, why wouldn't you apply? Which kind of tells me that maybe there's some more work to be done on the innovation side. And, you know, I think it was great for the folks that did apply, and I think everyone looking at the applications had a very credible story to tell. But, you know, as I start to look at some of the colleges in my old district, and I could have told you who was going to end up before this process, kind of in the various tiers, just by knowing the colleges in the Central Valley, and I was not surprised, and yet still worried about the colleges in the Central Valley that didn't apply at all. So I think, as we start the real story out of this award is really to point to the winners, and more importantly, to send the signal that, you've got to be able, every college should have really stood up and applied, I think, in this particular competition. And I also know that there's some sense that, this thought about some sort of equity in the process. I have a totally different view of this. I think I've talked to some of you about it. I kind of look at this as the Aspen Prize or something of that sort. I probably err on the side that I would give the whole $50 million to the one winner. And I think really kind of send the signal out that this is a very serious prize, and it's meant for the top innovators in our systems, and that there's something to really strive for and compete for. And it's not to say that all of the tiers aren't important, but I think staff did a fantastic job of actually pouring through the process. And the thing I love about the Department of Finance more than any institution, I didn't like it much when I was in the legislature, but but I now appreciate it here, is that completely devoid of the politics and on the merits. I really, really appreciate you folks doing that. I think it's a very, very good process in that way. And I think things just rose to the top that needed to be recognized. And I think in the middle, is some work that needs to be done. And I hope the governor will continue to look at this program as an ongoing message for those folks who are just a couple of points away, that probably with a little more work would probably end up in a great place, maybe in the future. So I think you scored it in the right way. And obviously I would have loved to see a lot of schools in my old district kind of rise to the top. But I think ultimately those who I thought did. And those who need a few more points, I think, is the signal that we need to do more work going forward. And at some point, trying to find some funds, some recognition, et cetera. So, the only request I would have as we talk about this is not necessarily reallocation of dollars. I don't necessarily think that's the way to go. But I do think that we should say to Tier 3 and some of the folks that maybe didn't make the cut, that they should be recognized in some way of making, in name only, if anything, of saying that there's some sort of recognition that they were in that category. And that doesn't mean money. That really says, that they are very innovative, and more importantly, I think, kind of reach some sort of standard of, get gold standard, silver standard, something of that sort. So I think you guys did a great job, and I really appreciate the process, Mr. Chair.
Which sort of taking that thought of why didn't additional schools apply, could you just tell us a little bit about how you notified the schools, the interaction with the schools, both at the campus level as well as the system level, and the kinds of reactions you got, and were you a little frustrated as far as some people not being that interested, or did you get cooperation everywhere? What was the whole process about?
Sure, and I may be a little bit fuzzy on the details on all of it, but we did reach out to the segments, and so we met with the segments in developing the program, in developing the application to figure out how, and so by segments I mean the system offices in each of the segments. And we also reached out to chancellors and superintendents and presidents of individual institutions to let them know that that this was a new program and that there was a process coming up. We, I think, over the course of the fall, did quite a few calls and outreach to and meetings with different stakeholder organizations and others who also have connections to local campuses. So we tried to reach institutions in a variety of different ways. I think the reaction in many ways reflected the same kinds of conversations we had at the first two committee meetings. This is a bit of a different way of allocating money, and so we had a similar type of dialogue that this committee had about exactly what this is, and kind of breaking it out, that two-part process of recognizing innovators, and then the second part kind of figuring out how money would be spent. So I think I wouldn't characterize as frustrated at all. So I think we were excited. We answered a lot of questions and had a lot of people reaching out to figure out what this was. And so I think we've been excited and whether 58 was high or low, it probably exceeded our own expectations about how many would apply.
So one of the things I want to comment is a point of clarification. There are two components, right? There's a coordinating institution, and then there is a participating institution, right? If you look at the participating institution, 100% of the UC actually participated, right, which is huge. And if you look at the CSU, 91% of the CSUs participated. Only 2 weren't participating campuses. If you look at community colleges, you're at 63%. So I'm more concerned about the community colleges that didn't apply, from that perspective in terms of percentages of participating. So it's part of that conversation as well. But, I mean, if you look at it, to get 100% UC, 91% CSU participating is pretty significant.
Certainly, just in follow-up to Senator Florez's comment, the governor's office is planning on kind of issuing a press release this afternoon on terms of winners. So if we want to designate honorable mentions or whatever, we can do that, and we're very able to kind of acknowledge and recognize districts that applied, whether or not when we get to the money discussion that they're awarded dollars. So we can certainly keep that going as we have a conversation.
Thank you. The remaining parts 1 and 2 of the staff recommendation to the extent
Right.
that.
So why don't at this point I turn to public comment, see if there's anyone who wants to publicly comment before I think we'll probably get to a motion. So come on down. I think there's a microphone here at the podium. I think I just said come on down. So it's my game show host is my dream has been served.
And Chair Cohen, before we, and just to follow up on the thought that the discussion here, the 2 parts of the recommendation do identify, the first part is to identify the awardees, and the second part, is a statement about recognizing the innovation. If the committee were to want to build that out into something else or to change the phrasing of that recommendation, you're certainly able to do so.
Right.
Thank you. My name is Frank Gornick. I'm representing West Hills Community College District.
We,
Is that better? No? Okay. I would like to comment, number one, thank you. Thank the governor for this innovative approach to awarding innovation in itself. And number two, I wanted to comment on former Senator Flores' comments about the Department of Finance. From our perspective, you were a fair arbiter. When we apply for funds, we usually have to go through either federal or state agencies that are like us in some way. They have an educational component, and I realize you have an educational component, but you're focusing on finance. So the uniqueness of this award coming out of finance was very attractive, and I think sent a signal to us anyway that everything was on the up and up. The second thing I wanted to comment to you was that on the criteria that was established, that was very helpful for our district and our colleges, because as we examined that, it created for us an opportunity to discuss what we were doing and the innovations that we were developing and have developed and want to develop. And so that was just as beneficial for us going through that process, even if we hadn't won anything or been awarded anything. We really enjoyed that, and I think it speaks to the fact that you have that objective view of focusing on the intent of the legislation, and made it very beneficial for us. So I want to thank you for that.
thank you.
Good morning. Eloy Oakley, President of Long Beach City College. 2 comments. First, I'll wear my Long Beach hat, and I just want to say thank you to the committee and to staff on behalf of the entire Long Beach College Promise Partnership for recognizing the work that a lot of good people are doing and have been doing for many, 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 many years. Now, I'll take off my Long Beach hat and just say I think that this has sent a wonderful signal to the state of California that we really want to see our public institutions work together, move forward, think about the challenges we face differently, and to meet those challenges. So I hope that we take this as an opportunity to continue to gain momentum, that we just not leave this as a one-time opportunity, that we continue to work throughout the 3 segments as well as K-12 to continue to push for innovation. Because I think, as you saw from those who participated, they got very excited about this opportunity, and I think that excitement we need to continue to fulfill. And then finally, I just want to publicly thank the governor for having the courage to put this forward and to put this in the budget and to continue to push for innovation.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Julia Lopez with the College Futures Foundation, formerly the College Access Foundation. And our tagline kind of says how we're aligned with you all. Our tagline says, more graduates for a thriving California, which is really what this is all about. I guess we're going to just repeat ourselves a little bit. I think that you all did a wonderful job. Staff certainly did. I certainly appreciated the guidance the committee gave the staff the last time around. Those were really substantive and meaty conversations. So I think as a whole, it's been a great process. I think, as some of you have said, the state is the winner. It's not really just who will actually get the money. I think the state is the winner. A few weeks back, we funded a showcase to just basically showcase the fact that all of these folks have been doing wonderful things in a time of real fiscal constraints. And that's the message that we really ultimately want to continue to send. Having said that, I do think that the price needs to be considered meaningful. And I think the staff recommendations essentially do that. Whether, it's the 1 or the 14, the point is that there was a process that everybody can respect to really have and showcase those that met the criteria at a certain level. And we ought to honor that, I think, very much so. Just one last comment I want to say. I think that it is notable that there are so many collaborative efforts, because as Eloy alluded to, that is the future, given resource constraints in the future. And we also know that's really hard work and long-term work. And so the fact that we're going to recognize a number of those collaborations will also send a signal to others to think differently about how they do, because ultimately innovation is not invention. Innovation is really using whatever resources you have differently to achieve something better, more efficiently. And we as a foundation are committed, I've mentioned this to Michael Cohen, we as a foundation are committed to do everything we can to support the group of winners here to figure out how they can really actually succeed and go forward, because I think in the end, we are all winners in that sense. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Londa Ajose. I'm the Deputy Director at California Competes, and we wanted to congratulate the staff and the committee for the hard work of selecting colleges for these awards. The awards themselves, as well as the proposed winners, really, I think, present the best that California has to offer. The innovation and the ingenuity that it takes to tackle a problem in ways that both help to fuel our economy as well as help to provide both personal and economic opportunity for the residents of our state, and I think that's very important. We were really pleased last week to be able to co-sponsor, along with several other organizations, the Innovation Awards Showcase, which was really an opportunity to celebrate. It was an opportunity to bring together all of the colleges who could travel to Sacramento to really talk about the spirit of innovation that's taking place on our campuses and how important that is, and how important it is, particularly when you have a number of campuses that aren't applying for these awards, to underscore that innovation can happen without a grant program, that innovation can happen because you invest in partnerships, because you have extraordinary leadership on your campuses. And so we really were excited that 35 colleges and 175 people came to Sacramento last week to celebrate that. And last week was about everyone, but today's different, right? Because today's really about the winners. I understand that you'll be kind of taking on two big questions today. One is about whether or not to award prizes to those first three tiers, and the second question is about how those funds should be distributed, and I'd like to comment briefly on each. On the issue of who should get an award, there's a whole body of research that shows that awards are highly sought after when they are highly valued, and awards are highly valued when they are scarce. The biggest example of that is if we were all to receive MacArthur Genius Awards, they wouldn't feel so special, right? So similarly, for this award to really maintain its value and to maintain its impact and to maintain its credibility, and for it to continue to spur the colleges to do the best and most innovative work, we think the number of awardees should be fewer and not greater. These awards are not about ensuring that all deserving institutions are supported in their innovation. That's a grants program. These awards are very different. These awards are about giving prizes to those who have the very best innovations with the idea that those innovations can be replicated and scaled across the state. So we just encourage you to think about those 14 that you've recommended and not expanding the number. On the question of funding levels, the staff has proposed that tiers 1, 2, and 3 kind of evenly split the prize monies. And while that provides for meaningful resources for each, the prize was really conceived to celebrate the spirit of innovation that already exists at our colleges. We might suggest that you think about tier 1 being higher than tier 2, and tier 2 even being higher than tier 3. Rather than awarding, and maybe not $50 million for one, I don't know that I'd go there, but rather than the same award amount for everyone, why not give maybe $5 million to tier 1, $3 million to tier 2, and $2.5 million to tier 3? Magically, you would hit the $50 million number. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Joe Wise. I'm Superintendent President of Shasta College. And instead of repeating what some of my colleagues have said about how great the staff has done, I'll just let you know a couple of additional things that are already happening that I think embody the vision of what this award is about. And an example is that in February, Shasta College helped lead and participated in a summit in Chico where we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 high school and college representatives, and they were discussing what our award application was about, dual enrollment and expanding those options for students. So we're already working with those in the North State to spread the word on how our innovation is successful in our eyes and what we're seeing as results. And so we're already seeing kind of the goal of this happening, I think, and I expect that to be happening other places around the state as well. And another example I'll just point out with Long Beach is that a couple of years ago we had a team from our county go down to Long Beach and visit and find out more about the Long Beach Promise. And there's now a Shasta Promise and even a North State Promise for a few counties that we're working on, kind of modeling after what you're doing. So we're already seeing these sorts of collaborations and learning from one another happen. So I just thought I'd share that with you.
Well, thank you all for your comments. And on behalf of the Department of Finance, certainly all the accolades are well received. It's not always the case that finance is exactly. Yeah, popularity is not in our job description typically. So thank you all for that. So now I think turn to the members and see if there's comfort with the remaining pieces of the staff recommendation here to recognize the 14 in groups 1 through 3, and we'll still have the conversation on the award amounts after that. And then on the group 4, I think term them honorable mentions if that's acceptable to the committee in terms of acknowledging their innovation as well.
Can we take a vote on that, or at least I'd like to hear what the committee has to say about Group 4.
Yeah.
Whether we automatically say they're out or
Right.
automatically honorable mention. So I'd love to hear a little discussion on that.
Sure. What are folks' thoughts having read through Group 4 compared to some of the higher scoring items? Yeah, Sue.
Well, I'm comfortable with the staff recommendation to make the awards in groups 1, 2, and 3. I think we've all heard and also provided accolades to Department of Finance about a very rigorous process, very transparent, clear on the criteria. And I'll just say as for one member of the group, I'm not prepared to kind of interject myself into that process and suggest that we pluck people out of other tiers. So I would support the staff recommendation that we provide the awards in groups 1, 2, and 3, but that we recognize group 4. We can talk about what that looks like, definitely in the press release. And if we want to send certificates from the governor or something along those lines, maybe we want to do that. But I'm prepared to make the motion to adopt the staff recommendation.
Monica?
I just want to reiterate my original comment that I think the process, and we heard it in public comment, the process is so valuable. It brings multi-segments together, it reaches out to the community, it forces people to think about our criteria and the factors that we think will really drive innovation in higher education. And I would feel much more comfortable stopping with the staff recommendation and recognizing in the press release all of the effort that went in from all of the however many 60-plus applications that we received, as opposed to not saying anything about Group 5, which then would call into question, just how well did they do. So I would prefer that we go with the original recommendation and highlight all of the effort and use this award to encourage those that weren't in the top 3 tiers to continue to do the hard work, and hopefully, if we're able to replicate this again next year, they'll come back with an even stronger application. That would be my recommendation.
The difference between the lowest of Group 3 and the highest of Group 4 at times is only a couple points. But the truth is, in life, you have to draw the line somewhere. And I think finance has drawn it well, and I would support that. The idea of honorable mention for Group 4 is well-meaning and well-intended, and they certainly deserve something. On the other hand, this sounds a little bit like elementary school where everybody gets to be a winner. And, we're all adults. It's the real world. And I think providing information to Group 4 and 5 about what could have been done better and treating them like adults, but making it clear 1, 2, and 3 are the winners and that's it, that would be my preference, and to not try to do an honorable mention.
Just the last point is, Christian, do you want to, I know Constant Carroll is not here and she wrote a document. Do you want to reflect her opinion on this, or do you want to bring that to light a little bit?
Sure. So Member Carroll had sent comments that were distributed to each of the members. There were several options, and I'll just pull them up quickly and we can run through them. But I think in order to, she did propose that applications in Group 4 receive awards and 2 of the options, and then in the following item we can talk about how much basically all of the applications in Group 4 under 2 of the alternatives she had suggested would receive awards, and in the following item we would decide how much, or the committee would decide how much the applications would receive. The third alternative was that the applications coordinated by community colleges receive awards.
Okay. Well, I think I heard a motion from Sue to adopt the staff recommendations on item 1 and 2, which just for the record to repeat that the committee is identifying applications in groups 1, 2, and 3 as specified in Appendix 3 as awardees, and that the committee recognizes the innovation of the applications in Group 4 as specified in Appendix 3. Is there a second for that motion?
I second that.
I just wanted to clarify, I think it sounded like the committee might have wanted to take the same action on Group, on that second part as they did on Part 3, so that it would be more worded like the committee takes no further action, with the understanding that we would kind of follow up with the applicants and then recognize them all in the same way.
Perfect. As amended,
Yeah, I second that.
second. Go ahead and call the roll, please.
Cohen?
Aye.
Mr. Avalos?
Aye.
Ms. Burr? Aye. Mr. Faigin? Yes. Mr. Florez? And Ms. Lozano?
Thank you, members. So turning to item C is the approval of award amounts. I think here we've got now 14 awardees. The decision is really, do we spread the money evenly or tier them? One of the public testimony suggested 5, 3, 2.5. I'm hoping staff has double-checked the math there.
No, it's not correct.
It's
I've
not
already
correct.
checked it. No,
Okay.
it's not correct.
I believe one is correct, a tiering option of 4.5, 3.5, 2.5.
That's correct.
Or spreading them equally would be about $3.6 million, just below that. So discussion, Senator Florez had made the point about kind of a more, the top tier getting more, which would lead to the 4.5, 3.5, 2.5, unless people wanted to spread that more or argue for a even distribution. Monica, go ahead. No, I think I was, just repeating his notion.
Again, I just want to start by saying how remarkable these applications were, and the work that's been going on is just extraordinary, especially among those who are in the top 3 tiers. I want to advocate that we recognize Tier 1 at a higher level. I think when you look at the scoring, you look at the depth of the application, the innovations that have been put into practice, not one of them is the same. They're focusing on outcomes, but coming at them in different ways. And I think their experiences and their commitment really should be heralded as a best practice. Certainly not to be modeled by everybody else, because institutions are different, communities are different. But I would advocate, I had come in prepared to recommend to my fellow commissioners that Tier 1 get $5 million, and that the others, 9, be evenly distributed, which is about 2.77. But having heard public comment, I actually think, given that we had said originally that we wanted no less than 2.5, I would be prepared to recommend that we go 5, 3, and 2.5. I feel very strongly that Tier 1 should be singled out with a higher amount for almost perfect scores, frankly, in all of those criterias that we had identified.
So have you guys done the math? Does
$5 million for Tier 1, $3 million for Tier 2, and $2.5 million for Tier 3 would result in $50 million in awards.
job applications up on our website. So,
What Member Lozano mentioned. So it was 5 million, then what?
5, 3, and 2.5.
right, so 5 million for Group 1, 3 million for Group 2, 2.5 million for Group 3 is a viable option, but let's hear from other...
Yeah, for me personally, I think the proportional that was, I think, suggested earlier, which is 4.5 for Group 5, for Group 1, and then 3.5 for Group 2, and then 2.5 for Group 3. So basically, each tier, there's a decrement of $1 million, right? So proportionally.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, to a certain degree, there is a, when you look at the difference between a Group 1 and a Group 2, is there a significant gap between that 5 and 6 to merit a $2 million difference? So that's the big question.
So we've got two, is there anyone who wants to argue on behalf of equal distribution? So far, I haven't heard anyone, but, okay, so just making sure that isn't on the table. So we've got two options, I would say, are fairly similar, but it's sort of how much do you emphasize Group 1 versus sort of a more even distribution of the step down on awards with the 4.5, 3.5, 2.5. Maybe if we can hear from a couple of the other members, Doug, and hopefully we kind of drive to consensus here.
The one benefit of the 5 million proposal, or a benefit, is going along with one of the speakers had mentioned the greater rarity and impact that awards make, the greater they are assumed to be important. And the greater we can make the top prize, I think, the greater the impact. So is there a difference between 4, 5, and 5? I don't know. But I would kind of advocate going to the upper end for the Group 1 based upon the idea of trying to emphasize as much as possible the value of what they've done.
Susie, you have?
No, I agree with those comments. I'm persuaded by the public comment and also the notion that they, as Member Lozano mentioned, had close to perfect scores. There was really seems to be standout scores in that first group. So I would support the higher amount, the 5 million for Group 1.
Senator Florez, do you want to?
No, I think
wait,
that's fine.
That's fine. The end of the table, how you feeling?
Yeah. I mean, I think well, I hear what everyone's saying in terms of, looking at, making it meaningful. So I do see that. When I look at, the first 5, and I look at the scale of impact, not every community college, not every university is created equal, right? Each program has, a bigger impact or smaller impact.
Right.
So I think that's the only thing I worry about by going big. It could definitely be a big drop in a small bucket for certain institutions. So that's why I would say if we did it proportionally, it kind of smooths it out. Because at the end of the day, there's some sort of discretion and subjectivity in what, who fell in number 5 versus 6, and we're saying it's a $2 million gap. And if that's really what we want to reward, the difference between someone who was 6 versus someone who was number 5, do they merit the difference? So I go with any which way at the end of the day, but, I think it's important to have the discussion. Like, for example, does Shasta really deserve $2 million over San Francisco State if the delta difference in the final score was a 2.5? Right? That's the only question.
Yeah, the scores were clearly bunched. I kind of feel the bulk of the committee going to the slightly higher awards, the 5 million, unless, do you want to?
Well, you know where I stand.
Yeah, so that's
Probably the extreme.
right.
What is the differential between both approaches?
I think you have to talk in the mic because it's streaming.
I'm sorry. What is the differential between both approaches just mentioned? Arnoldo's 1 million between cheers and the approach that maybe Monica laid out, monetary-wise? What's the...
It's basically 500,000 more for Group 1 and 500,000 less for Group 2.
And Group 3 stays the same, no matter what?
Exactly. So I think in either case, we're sending a similar message of rewarding the higher scores, and it's just sort of how pronounced that is.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Before we actually vote on this, I just want to make the point that even though there's sort of an implied assumption that these people are going to get these amounts, I want to emphasize that these are amounts allocated for these people based upon their proposals being accepted by this committee. And I want to speak a little more to that in the next discussion. But let's not forget that we're not making a decision here to give the money. We're making a decision to give the money if they come back with proposals that we accept at that point.
Correct. Good point. So, well, why don't I pause here to see if any of the public want to weigh in on this issue any further. Seeing none, so I think we've probably talked to. I think at this point that would be appropriate.
And I can state the motion, Member Lozano, if you want, and then you can. So the motion would be the committee awards a total of $50 million to the awardees identified by the committee at this meeting, with $5 million to each of the applications in Group 1, $3 million to each of the applications in Group 2, and $2.5 million to each of the applications in Group 3.
So moved. Is there a second for that?
I'll second.
Second by Sue. If we can go ahead and call the roll on that. Aye.
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 Yes.
Great. Thank you, committee members. Turning, yep.
I know we
But yes, staff, go ahead and
course.
reread the motion.
The committee awards a total of $50 million to the awardees identified by the committee at this meeting, with $5 million to each of the applications included in Group 1.
That's enough.
Okay.
My concern here is that gave the award. It's a statement of award, and we aren't giving those
Right.
awards. That's not what we're doing. We're saying this is the allocation for people. If they give proposals, we accept. And so I think we need to read.
I think what I would suggest we do is in our next motion, make it clear that awards shall not be dispersed until X, Y, Z. And so the award has been given, but the funds aren't leaving. So I think we can handle it in item D here, which is the approval of instructions on the proposed use of funds. Christian, do you want to run through staff's recommendation here?
Sure. And as discussed in the previous item, the committee is required to approve the proposed uses of an award before the Director of Finance releases funds to the coordinating institution. In the application package, the committee indicated its expectation that funds be used for appropriate one-time purposes that are related to the priorities of the Awards for Innovation in Higher Education program. Furthermore, the committee noted that while an award is a one-time allocation from the state, if an awardee proposes, funds can be spent over multiple years. Staff prepared the draft set of instructions for awardees, which is included as Appendix 1 to this item. These instructions are intended to align with the narrative in the application package. Awardees would be required to submit this report to the Director of Finance no later than April 10th, 2015. Staff's intent is to present reports received by the awardees to the committee for consideration at the meeting on April 27th. So the formal recommendation would read, first, the committee approves the instructions for the report on proposed uses of awards, included as Appendix A to this item, to be distributed by the Director of Finance to awardees. And second, the committee authorizes staff to take any necessary actions or make technical edits to these instructions consistent with the committee's direction and intent.
Okay, and I'll just again state that before we take a recommendation of that, we'll need to amend it to add some language about award funds not being dispersed until the next meeting and the criteria, so forth. But let's sort of turn to the committee in terms of comments, reactions to Appendix 1 to item D, where we would actually be giving the instructions to these awardees in terms of coming back to us for next month. Doug, go ahead.
To get back to my favorite topic, my concern is that we are here to do innovation. And by my way of thinking, innovation implies new things and trying new things to try and accomplish the goals. And the goals, obviously, that we all share and they're articulated very well in the documents here from the committee. The concern I have is that a lot of the activities that we have selected for the different groups are activities that have been essential to meet the goals. They're very well thought out, very well accomplished, but they've been going on for quite some time. And some of them, not all of them. But one of the most successful, obviously, is the Long Beach Promise. And that's probably been one of the most impressive things. I know when I first got on the CSU Board of Trustees, Senator Steinberg was rather emphatic about the benefits of that, and I was duly impressed. But as the president of Long Beach City College pointed out, Long Beach Promise has been going on for, I think the quote was, many, many, many years. Or I have skipped one of the manys, but the point is, it's no longer necessarily in what I would think is innovation. Kind of when I think of innovation, it's how do we do more with less? Are we using technology that have technological developments that have enabled industries and governments throughout the country to do more with less? Are we looking at that? And none of the 14, I think there was one, possibly Monterey Bay, that actually spoke to the use of larger online classes for math. But what I'd like to see is the committee at least informally indicating to the people who are now going to make the proposals, and possibly more formally with a motion, that while the instructions did include an acceptance of expanding on previous work, that we would nevertheless like to see proposals that could go a long way towards real innovation, new things, in part new technology. Things such as larger online classes is an idea. There's lots of other ideas. But personally, I'd rather not see proposals that are simply taking what people have done and continuing it on. And that's not to say that what people have done is without worth. In fact, obviously, it's so impressive and so necessary that I can't begin to describe it. But a lot of those things take off on Long Beach Promise because it mainly is getting more hands-on involvement with students at a younger age and guiding them and doing all the things that are necessary to ensure that they're having personal experiences with people who can encourage them and direct them towards the direction that will enable them to be successful in their college careers. That takes a lot of money, a lot of commitment, and a lot of effort. And the people who have been doing it are to be well commended. But the question is, we're here for innovation, to do things differently. And I, for one, would like to see proposals that would accomplish that.
If I could speak to something as well. I spent some time researching more about Monterey, CSU Monterey and the relationship with Arnoldo College. I've been impressed with the fact that this community college and the CSU come together to actually take a population of students from Salinas Valley, who for the most part are first-generation low-income students, and their commitment is to get them out with a CS degree in 3 years. That, to me, is innovation, right? I mean, 3 years, $10,000 a year per student, and they're going to come out earning anywhere from $70,000 to $100,000. That's life-changing. And that, to me, is something that I'd love to see replicated throughout the state of California. And so when I thought about innovation, and I went through and I said, well, there's practices that have been in place for a long time, to Member Faigin's point, and yet when you look at the results in terms of completion and transfer, you don't see the numbers really changing, right? So when I look at programs such as Hartnell Monterey and what they're doing, to me is just like, how'd they get there? And how can we invest in them to replicate that throughout the state? So, thank you very much, Member Faigin, for your points. Totally valid. And, that's what I'm looking for in innovation.
Yeah, Sue.
So to me, innovation takes different forms in different communities. And we at the state board are in the midst of what I call a seismic shift in the way we fund our K-12 districts and the expectations we have for them. But the sort of central tenet that we've heard our governor speak over and over again is subsidiarity, to be able to make those kinds of decisions locally. And so As I reflect on what the Budget Act said, and I'm looking at this, and to your point, Member Avalos, one of them is to significantly increase the number of bachelor's degrees awarded, and it strikes me that the Monterey Bay one that's a perfect example of that. Allow students to complete bachelor's degrees within 4 years and to ease transfer, all of which are reflected in some of these. But again, I think innovation manifests itself in a variety of different ways. And sometimes innovation in one community, we heard from Shasta versus Long Beach, takes off because they've seen it, but they're at a much earlier stage. So I would be reluctant to dictate to the awardees who have shown through these very competitive processes what they can do, what we expect them to do with money in a very specific way. That seems to be a little bit contrary to what the awards are about. I know we're supposed to approve the use of funds, but I agree with the way the staff has laid out a pretty open-ended process to ensure that they're furthering what the awards were given for, but not necessarily give a nod to one item over another.
I agree, actually, with both comments. I think there are innovative strategies, and that gives or allows for flexibility based on the needs of local communities and the student population within those communities. And then there's technology and the use of technology to deliver instruction, et cetera. One of the things that came out a lot in these applications is that technology tends to be the underpinnings of a data system for evaluation and tracking resources. I think that's absolutely necessary. You need data to make sound decisions. But I think what Doug says is important as well, which is that we could use technology to deliver instruction in a different way, and that might be something that over time we want to encourage districts to do more of, not just to use technology to identify data and to use that. So that's, I think, innovative strategies versus innovation in technology are actually two complementary things, but they don't necessarily touch each other. But I did want to make a comment about how are we going to identify areas that we think might need to be strengthened when the applications come back for the actual distribution. And I'm going to use the Monterey Bay, which I thought was spectacular. I mean, just to me, that was an innovative approach to delivering, high quality, getting students through on 3 years, et cetera. But it is a fairly small program, and if I understand it correctly, it's financed through a single foundation who is providing scholarships for it. So as I look at that, I think, how do we replace those funds over time so that it actually can scale up? I mean, that's just one question that came up on one application. So the question perhaps to you or to staff is, will you be working to identify areas that you think each one of these proposals might need strengthening, whether it's in sustainability or it's in any one of these other criteria areas, so that in fact we're able to help them focus perhaps this next round?
I think one of the points I would note, as part of this process, an applicant or a coordinating institution of an application could submit a report that describes uses of funds that aren't necessarily completely tied to what they described in their application. So the discussion that we've reflected in the committee, from the committee's September meetings, is that we provide some direction that they should be one time and that they should be linked overall to the state's priorities in the program, but that they might not necessarily be directly tied to what they described in their application. Separately, I think, that's a conversation that as we think about scaling and replicating these strategies, that might be a conversation we have, and we could also have it as part of this process, but it would be a little bit of a departure from what we've talked about previously.
Yeah, Doug, go ahead.
Do you have some thoughts about how you're going to provide the funds? I mean, will it be given over a period of time at different stages after you review their performance? Or will it lump sum and then you come back and look at, are they doing what they said they'd do? What's the mechanic plan?
Mechanically, I think our intent was to provide funds, upon approval by the committee of the proposed use of funds, to provide the funds at that time, and so all of the funds included in the award. We can certainly have a conversation. We'd have to think through mechanically how we have encumbered these, but our intent thus far has been to provide it at one point upfront.
Could I just make a suggestion that you at least consider, based upon the proposals that are accepted, whether they need the whole money up front, or whether it would be a good idea to give them half and then come back at some predetermined time to decide if they're doing it okay, and then give them the other half, or whatever. Those aren't the exact proportions, but.
Of course, and if it's okay with the committee, I think that would make sense to talk about at the next meeting once we've received the reports, and the reports will have some sense of timing that we can kind of work internally to figure out exactly how the mechanics work, and then present that to the committee.
Yep, go ahead.
I feel like we're struggling a little bit with whether this is an award or a grant, because a grant requires checking back, making sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and my understanding was this is intended to be an award. And I also just wanted to clarify that, again, through the Budget Act language, that there are evaluations of effectiveness that are expected in 2018 and 2019. So I wonder, Doug, if that kind of addresses that there will be a report on whether or not what they spent the money on was effective. I just worry, again, a little bit about setting roadblocks that aren't intended when you create awards as opposed to a grant.
Well, these are tax dollars. And I think it's reasonable to always, the idea of award, you're exactly right, but I personally don't see anything wrong if the proposal warrants it to at least break it up a little bit, regardless of whether you call it an award or a grant, just to make sure we're getting our money's worth. And, I don't know what the proposals would be, and I can't foresee this, but my guess would be there might be some awards that it would be necessary to do the whole lump sum up front in order for them to accomplish what they're proposing. And in other instances, maybe it would work to spread it out a little bit. But personally, I'd advocate, when we're dealing with that much in tax dollars, that we spread it out a little bit if it's appropriate, depending upon what the purpose for the award is.
Okay, before we go much further, why don't I pause for any public comment on this particular item? No? Okay. Yep. Let's get an on-the-ground perspective on this.
Joe Weiss from Shasta College. So I really appreciate your discussion, and want to pledge to do the best we can with these awards. I think I speak for all of us to say that. I would like to give a couple of thoughts, if I can say it clearly. One is sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get up to speed to spend the money well, rather than a rush, let's spend all this money in the next 12 months. So we're facing that with some other funds we're getting from the state of deadlines. You got to get it spent by now, and making sure we spend the money well. So, I would encourage you to consider timeframes to be a little more generous in the plans that come forward, and how that could sustain innovation longer for various districts. We've resisted writing a plan to spend money we didn't have yet. So we'll be working diligently over the next 8 weeks to have a very good plan for you. So just kind of keep that in mind. And then also, in the spirit of the award, sometimes having a little flexibility, 2 years from now, there may be something that we never thought of that is very innovative that we'd like to do. And so don't know if maybe these funds could be more flexible that way or not, but just a thought there to keep in mind that, perhaps having everything delineated immediately is not the best approach. So just a couple of thoughts that came to mind while I was sitting there.
Thank you.
Londea Jose. Just pursuant to this most recent conversation, we spent a lot of time in the last 6 to 8 months really trying to promote the idea of innovation amongst the colleges and the kind of acknowledgement that they get for the work they've already done and for the courage they've already demonstrated in really trying to do the really hard work of culture change on campus to really get at what does it mean to be innovative. And part of what innovation really suggests to people is this idea that you're thinking outside of the box to do what you need to do best to get at the kinds of outcomes that you have. And one of the things that we found as we talked with folks about innovation and about these awards is they often got confused because they thought of awards as being grant awards from a foundation as distinct from a prize. So we kept calling this a prize. You're being rewarded for the work you've already done. This is a prize. And the way in which the instructions were initially written was, this is a prize and you'll have to report. Certainly there's accountability because these are public dollars. But that there's flexibility here too. There's flexibility in you taking the same kind of enterprising spirit that you had to come up with these innovations in the first place and figure out how then to use those resources in ways that really help to advance your work. So I would just encourage you as you think about this next phase to really open up the possibilities for flexibility for these campuses and colleges, because they'll begin to do what they've already done, which is to think about uses for these resources that they wouldn't have otherwise imagined, because they are trying to kind of break through some barriers. And I think allowing them to have that kind of flexibility and really treating it as a Genius Prize, as something that they can then figure out how flexibly to use those dollars, really helps to benefit them to push the envelope around this notion of innovation.
Thanks. I would encourage and echo what Londea just said about staying open to flexibility and innovation. I mean, one of the real advantages of this award is that it was something that was rewarding work that people were already doing with existing resources, but they were doing something differently to get better outcomes. And if you focus on outcomes, which is really where we ought to focus on outcomes, then the onus ought to be on what you're going to get for this money, which is what you're talking about, Member Faigin, but on the other hand, not tell them how or when they have to use it. And so I think now that you have selected groups that I think, to me this is important. For me, the groups that you have selected have a track record. They're not starting from new, they're not starting from scratch. There's some confidence that they know what they're doing. What they now need to do is go back and think about what are the 2 or 3 or 4 things that they can invest in over the next few years that could just really up the results in their communities. And beyond that, I think the more flexibility you give them, both to start up and then to correct along the way, what the president from Shasta said is true. Something will happen that they may need to adjust. How you give them the flexibility to do that will really, I think, in the end, by 18, will really let us know how this works or not works. And I think that's what's exciting about it being an award and a flexible price and not a standard grant, either from the government or from EVA Foundation, that sometimes we do tend to be more compliance, rather than results oriented.
I couldn't resist. Eloy Oakley, President of Long Beach City College. First of all, to some of the comments, I think it is certainly true that we should continue to push for innovation. And a lot of work that's been done, and speaking for my colleagues in Long Beach, when I say it's been done for many, many years, they have been struggling through this without any state support, without any foundation support, doing it on their own and trying to find innovative ways to improve serving the students that live in and around Long Beach. And I think that's a key. Going forward, as our application suggests, we do plan on using technology. Technology in the way that we use predictive analytics, technology in the way that we advise students early on how to get through the system. And so that is certainly something, and I certainly invite all of you anytime to come down to Long Beach and talk to you about how we plan to innovate going forward. But I think part of this is also creating a culture of innovation. Just because work is being done doesn't mean the work stops where it's being done. And I think the more that we can encourage communities to continue to improve and to look for better ways, as Member Faigin said, I think that's the important part of this. And I certainly think, speaking for Long Beach, we will continue to try and find more and better ways and to continue to improve our outcomes. And hopefully from this, we can inform state policy. And I think that is another outcome we need to consider, is that these applications, these proposals should inform state policy in ways that we can scale this to the state and not just in local communities.
Hello, my name's Heidi Moore-Gwinnett, and I actually represent one of the collaborative partners. I represent Humboldt County Office of Education, which supports K-12 education in a very far north region and a very rural and isolated region, which is connected to the lovely Humboldt State University and College of the Redwoods Community College. What I'd like to assert with you folks here today is just the part of our application, and I believe the innovation that was rewarded so graciously by you folks today, centered around deep, entrenched, meaningful collaboration across the K-12 and higher ed continuum in our region. For us, that represents 31 explicit school districts, 82 specific schools in the K-12 continuum, plus again, Humboldt State University is the participating applicant and College of the Redwoods. For us, we want to move forward a lot of our intended collaborative efforts and to have a lot of explicit constraints on the financing would make it difficult when we're talking about 84 different agencies trying to collaborate. So I would like to encourage the flexibility. I fully entrust Humboldt State University in their fiscal management and oversight and look forward to potential flexibility so that we can move forward our collective regional agenda. Again, thank you.
Just want to clarify what I was saying regarding Long Beach City College and the Long Beach Promise. I think that's one of the most imaginative, effective programs that have come out of California education. And a lot of people do as well, and the results have shown what this can do. No way saying this should be, stopped or reduced or anything. It's got to expand. And being in the top tiers was well deserved. It should be there. That's absolutely correct. But what I was talking about was the proposals moving forward. Hopefully people would look at some innovative ideas, and some of the people have talked about that give expression to ideas that haven't been thought about before in ways. I'm not locked into technology. That was an example. In fact, what I would suggest is that maybe some of these things won't be successful. But if they're well thought out experiments and innovation that we're trying to move forward, and hopefully most of them will be successful, but if some aren't wholly or partly, that's okay, because we're trying, we're innovating, and we're experimenting. And that's, I think, what all this is about, is to try to move the goal, move us forward in accomplishing these stuff. CSU has been excluding 25,000 otherwise eligible applicants every year. Now, we got to get those people into the system and out. We all know what's happening as far as the need for graduates in this state for the future, and we're not meeting that goal where we are right now. And sometimes the only answers we hear are, we need more money, and we don't have it. I mean, the legislature and the governor have to deal with realities of what we have. And there's all sorts of competing, I think the CSU and obviously the UC, we believe that we need more money. And that's true. But at the same time, what about the disabled? What about this group and that group? And those competing interests are all out there. So the money, the way we would like it, is not there. And what I see this as all about is ways to innovate with new ideas that can, yes, build on the old stuff that is really working and admirable, but at the same time come up with stuff that we wouldn't have thought about before. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. The one interesting thing about this is April 10th is not too far away. And in this discussion here about new ideas, I don't know that we have enough time. Maybe we want to think about extending it, but maybe we don't. I think we probably don't. But the question I have, Christian, is what kinds of forms do you see these proposals of having to come out as? We don't need, I would think, whole budgets and detailed explanation beyond pretty serious directed ideas, right?
No, and if you'll refer to Appendix 1, it really is a narrative that we're asking. It's the name of the institution that would receive the money, whether they would distribute it to other participants in the that participated in the application, and then an explanation of how a narrative explaining how they intend to use the funds and why that's linked to the priorities of the program.
So while we don't have a lot of time for them to come up with great ideas from this day, we're not asking for a huge amount of detail. We're just asking for the concept.
Yes.
Michael, can I just ask for a clarification? Because it does say it needs to include a timeline for expenditure. And I really am compelled by what I heard in public comment about the need for flexibility. So I just want to make sure that those are not mutually excluded, it may not be a detailed budget,
Right.
but we've got to allow for flexibility. We all know that as we're going through processes as complex as these, things shift, and we need to allow people to adjust along the way. So even if just in, theory, we create a process that does allow for that flexibility, and it's well communicated to the awardees. I just want to make sure that's there.
And I would add that I think we included that as kind of trying to expand the thinking that it could be used over the course of more than 1 year. If that feels limiting, I think our intent was really more to signal to an awardee this doesn't have to be used in a single fiscal year at a single time. And so we would certainly be open to amendments if that.
And I assume staff will be having conversations with the awardees over the coming weeks in terms of supplying this information. I would encourage you to, reemphasize the flexibility. That we would like to know the general timelines that the money's being spent, but not, however it makes the most sense to further the innovation, not a particular, not a restricted timeline.
And a point of clarification, where do the metrics for the success metrics come into play and accountability on the back end, 2018? I think that's really important as well, right? And is it driven by the awardee, if you will, in terms of defining their metrics, or is the Department of Finance going to help them define those metrics?
We haven't fleshed that out, and I think that's certainly something that the committee at its following meeting could discuss. I think our initial reaction would be each of the applications had a section on evaluation. Items 11 and 12 of each application identified a set of metrics that they would use, and then item 11 was the set of metrics that they intended to use, both quantitative metrics as well as qualitative evaluations that they intended to consider, and then item 12 was their goals. And so I think in our initial discussions, though, I don't think we've nailed this down, so we'd be happy to come back with a more well-formed proposal. But I think that would be the basis upon which the applicant would be submitting reports to the committee is, how are you doing given the goals that you set for yourself in the application submitted to the committee?
Yeah, I think that's really important, right? I mean, I think at the end of the day, to Member Faigin's point, this is an investment, right, to the state of California. This is tax dollars being used and allocated. So we want to make sure there's some sort of return on that investment. And we want to make sure that, if they come in with goals, I would like to establish stretch goals, right? I'd like to just not say, thank you very much for establishing your goal. No, why don't you think about tweaking it 2 steps above or 2% above? So I think, having that expectation of, yeah, this is great, And thank you for your goals, but, why don't you set a little higher goal and to see how that plays out as well? Because, if you just expect people to do what they're going to do, then they more likely will hit that. But if you expect to stretch them more to really get a better return, then maybe they'll rally around that and make it happen. So, that's what I would love you and Department of Finance to really think about as well.
Just to add a comment for the committee, one of the criteria that the applicants were judged on was actually the ambitiousness and the appropriateness of the targets they set out and the particular metrics they chose. So that can maybe give you a bit of assurance that among your top winners, staff at least felt that they had good goals set out for themselves, appropriate ways of measuring the activities they were describing, and ambitious goals as well.
Christian, I just wanted to clarify again that I don't necessarily see it, and maybe I'm missing it, when you make the award, there in the Budget Act language, there was a requirement that they commit to reporting to you by 2018 on the number of bachelor's degrees awarded and the length. Do you need that explicit in the instructions that those commitments have to be made both for 2018 and 2020?
They've committed in the applications that they submitted. Each of the applications included an assurance that the coordinating institution would submit those reports. I might propose that might be something we could bring to you for at the following committee meeting, a more concrete description of what that looks like.
Okay, very good discussion. Is there a motion for the staff recommendation as amended to note that award fund shall not be dispersed until after the April 27th meeting and the committee's approval of the awardees' use of funds proposal?
I'll move it with that amendment.
Thank you. Is there a second? Seconded. Can you call the roll on that, please? Aye.
Mr. Avalos?
Aye.
Ms. Burr?
Aye.
Mr. Faigin?
Yes.
Ms. Florez? Ms. Lozano?
All right, that concludes our action agenda items today. There's another public comment period here. Would anyone like to make a comment?
Hi, Paul Feast from the California Community College's Chancellor's Office. The Chancellor's Office would just like to thank the committee and the Department of Finance for the thorough evaluation of these applications and congratulate today's awardees. Further, we stand ready to highlight and disseminate the innovative practices rewarded here today through our work through our new Institutional Effectiveness Division. This division is working in close partnership with community colleges to provide technical assistance and professional development resources throughout our system. One of the activities of this division is the establishment of a clearinghouse that will bring together hundreds of resources to provide to the system and use modern tools like predictive analytics to help practitioners gather these practices. So we stand ready to help you replicate and scale up these innovative ideas. Thank you.
Thank you to the Chancellor's Office as well as the CSU Chancellor's Office and the Office of the President of UC. All should be very proud of your member campuses and their success here. So any other comments from the committee? Monica, Jim?
I was just going to ask if at the next meeting, we could also get a sense of the dissemination strategy.
Yep.
I do think it's critical. It came up in the public comment as well, and I think it should be one of our obligations is to make sure that we're able to spread our learnings as widely as possible.
Absolutely. Good idea. Okay, with that, we've got a few items that will definitely be on the April 27th agenda, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you all very much.